Good evening, and welcome to WANA Live, the reading series of the Writers Association of Northern Appalachia. I'm your host, Damian Dressick. This is your other host,
Christina Fasonic. So I'm guessing by your laps there that you have had a rough day. Have you had a rough day?
Like I have any other kind.
That's true. That is true. So tonight we have an.
Although I will share, my daughter found she wrote 2 new verses to a song she's been working on, and it was really super cool to hear. So
that is a good thing. And I don't hear your dog in the background singing the song of his people, so that's a good thing too, right?
I believe he's eating the couch.
Oh, well,
mouthful.
Right. Okay, so tonight we do have a new reader and yet another author who is bringing on a new book to us, which is always super exciting. So let's learn more about Jeff. So Jeff Newberry is an essayist, novelist, and poet. His writing has been published in a wide variety of print and online journals, including Apalachee Review, Brevity, Concise Nonfiction, the MacGuffin, Memorious, North American Review, Southeast Review, South Florida Poetry Review, Suite, and others. His chapbook, A Visible Sign, was a nominee for the Conference on Christianity and Literature's Book of the Year. His other publications include a collection of poetry, Brackish, a collaborative manuscript with the poet Justin Evans, Cross Country, and a novel, A Stairway to the Sea. He teaches in the Writing and Communication program at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College in Tifton, Georgia. And I just realized something. Jeff, is it Newberry or Newberry?
It's Newberry, like a strawberry.
Got it. And I didn't even think about it until I was reading your name, and because I've never heard you pronounce it before.
Yeah, I guess you don't go around saying you're like. I guess on the first day of class, I'll say something like, "I'm Dr. Newberry. I'm going to be your guide this term, or whatever." So yeah.
I tell my students just call me Dr. F because they'll never remember how to pronounce my last name. So you're reading from your new book tonight. That's exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited about the new book. It came together over at the very end of the pandemic. There were parts of it I had written. The genesis of the book, and I can show it real quick on the feed here. Let me see. Let me turn my virtual background on. This is it right here. It's from Red Hawk Publications. My friend Al McGinnis has a book there too. I'd plug his new and selected poems from there. But the genesis of the book is several years back now, about 8 years ago. My mother, who's still living, called me and said, "Hey, my I think it was her 50th high school reunion was in Seminole County, Georgia." And I said, "Okay, that's great, Mom. You want to go? Like, why are you calling? My mom doesn't drive." And she said, "Will you take me?" And I said, "Sure." So I got us an Airbnb on Lake Seminole. And my father's been dead since 1990, a long time. And I didn't know that side of the Newberrys very well. He was kind of a black sheep, so I didn't really know that side of the family. And it just so happened that my mom's best friend in high school was my dad's cousin, or my second cousin. And so she happened to be at this high school reunion too. And so we all, I drove them to around, and she realized I didn't know much about my family. And so she was kind of taking us around their old neighborhood, showing me stuff. And at one point we drove out on this little country road, and her name is Glenda. She's passed away now. She said, "Turn right here." And it was this dirt road into this cotton field. And so I drove down in the middle of this cotton field. There's this well-kept graveyard out there. And we got out of the car, and I said, what is this? And she said, "Well, these are your people." And my dad hadn't been buried there. He'd been buried like in a cemetery in town. And these were ancestors going back to like the Civil War. And I stood there for a second, and I just remembered this feeling of like, I don't even know how to respond. Like, I've felt most of my life trying to figure out who I am because of my father's early death. And then to kind of see, these graves all around, it was that moment that led to a sonnet that wound up in my book, which I'll read in a few minutes here. And the name, of course, is escaping me right now. Family Plot is the name of the poem. And that gave me a centerpiece for this book.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, you know what I would like, Jeff?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear some of this book.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm happy to read a few and talk a bit about kind of what I'm doing here.
We will disappear and let you do that.
Okay,
We'll be
great.
back. We'll be back.
Great. Don't hang me out to dry. I'm gonna this book, as I said, it's available soon. It's not out quite yet. We're working on final edits. I just okayed the final edits the other day for Red Hawk Press. It'll be available in all your favorite bookstores, I'm sure. This book is dedicated to my parents. It's the first one I've done that. It begins with an epigraph from Emily Dickinson. When it goes, just like the distance on the look of death. I'm going to read the opening poem of the book and then a couple of others. And the opening poem is How to Talk About the Dead. And it says, mention them by name only if you must. Give them death's privacy. Let them be no more than ghosted syllables, word shapes. Talk about their hands, the lined palms, a lifeline that branches to anabranch and disappears. Remember veined wrists, purple and thin as pine saplings. Resist the urge to turn those lines to words. Remember instead aftershave and lilac or alcohol and sweat, the presence they left behind. Do not quote the dead. Their words will not resurrect them. Instead, recall only the timbre of a voice, how it brought you here now. You grunt and grasp at meaning, a traveler in some foreign land, each ached sentence a muted plea. The natives could take you for dumb. They pity you instead. And that poem appeared in Crab Orchard Review several years ago, and it gave me the title. And so I'll read now the poem I was talking about, Family Plot. And this was originally in Main Street Rag. It reads, we turn down a nearly invisible path into a cotton field and follow the red dirt deep into the rows where my cousin shows me a fenced graveyard, the broken gray stones worn and cracked with age, the etched numbers and names faded. I wander between markers and wonder why my father, before he died, had never so much as uttered a word about this place, where my people molder beneath soil they worked but never owned. This is our family, my cousin says, and spreads her arm to gesture all around. It is as close as I have ever felt to them, buried in the ground. Both my parents, my mom and dad, were sharecroppers' kids, and they spent their childhoods working land that didn't belong to them. And I have a poem in my first book in Brackish about, it's called Sharecropping, and it's a bit about how I feel in some ways like I'm working, tending this soil of the past. It doesn't really belong to me. It's my parents, but I've always been interested in that. Of course, my genesis, my coming of age is not Georgia. My coming of age is North Florida, which is this weird hinterland, somewhere between a state and a region, somewhere between a marsh and a swamp, somewhere between Florida and Georgia and Alabama. I edited a book with the poet Brent House. We called it The Gulf Stream. And it was kind of a response to like the main stream or the other stream. We called it the Gulf Stream. And it was poems about the Gulf Coast. And Brent in the introduction writes, he calls it a kind of American hinterland. And I feel that way a lot. I often hear in Georgia, my students, they'll say, what's it like growing up there? And I'm like, well, it's a lot like here, but with water. As much agriculture as in South Georgia, there was, I guess, aquaculture. All the people I knew were fishermen. My hometown was a mill town. And so that's my genesis, like growing up by the water. And I'm going to read a couple of poems about that. This poem is called Oysters, which I grew up eating from the half shell. Once shuckers would crowd 13 or more on an ordered dozen, crusty shells packed to the edge of a tray, like ice mineral salts between them, where they lay, splayed, bivalves divers once risked breath to bring to the air. I've long heard tales of pearls nestled deep in the gray-white flesh, but never felt one hard and round on my tongue. My father poured them from the shell into his open throat and swallowed them with drops of crystal hot sauce, with long draughts of bitter beer from a long neck. We could shuck them ourselves, but raw bars promised tray after tray of Apalachee's finest. Now the beds have shrunk in red tide, the oysters fewer and fewer. A price makes the raw bars stingy. A dozen is just a dozen, as though just now we've gleaned their value, the pearl of their promise. And I'll read this one. I don't know if you've ever been into a salt marsh, but they're kind of swampy and dangerous if you slip down in one. And I once was fishing in a salt marsh and got my leg caught. And this kind of led me to this meditation about what it means to be caught in land that may not be land, somewhere between land and water, but also in some landscape that you love, but it's also very dangerous. This is called Salt Marsh. Once fishing in the sawgrass, my pole held high above, I sunk a leg to the thigh into marsh and felt the earth hold me fast, the rotted weeds and sand below a threat to pull me deep and preserve me there, where muck and shale turns shells to peat, where fossils dissolve to become one with the earth reabsorbed. I could be a bog body to unearth ages from now, specimen A in some archaeological exploration, my deflated body now corpus, evidence that the world changes but does not change. I twisted my foot until it let me go and fell into the bracken and swallowed seawater. Gasping, I took great gulps of air and coughed, saved for the moment from the spongy soil that reclaims us all, that preserves us. We grew up fishing on the Gulf Coast there, Port St. Joe Bay, St. Joseph's Bay, where I grew up. And I'm going to end with two poems about fishing. I grew up eating a type of fish called a mullet fish. And when I was a kid in the 90s, a mullet was a haircut, a party in the back, business in the front. But a mullet fish is a bottom feeder. Some people call them trash fish. If you catch them and cook them, you got to cook them soon because they go bad very quickly. And so where I live now, South Georgia, I'm a good 3 or 4 hours away from the Gulf. It's hard to get good mullet up here because once you drive them somewhere, they lose their flavor. And so this one is called Ode to the Mullet Fish. Small-mouthed trash fish no one wants to eat save the locals who know your sweet, oily meat. My mother used to get you for free from the fishery down by the canal, who threw in your spiny backbone and clotted roe. When my father threw his cast net into the bay, the weights took it low, where you ran, bottom feeders like all of us. 40 years later, I tried to order you crisp and fried in a Georgia restaurant. 3 hours from the bay we once called home. The flesh tasted strong and briny. I'd forgotten. Too far from the sea. You're quick to rot. You need the salt to extend your life, to hold the taste inside, just like me. And I'll end with this last poem. Not only did we fish, the Gulf, which was like salt water, we also fished the kind of sloughs and brackish water, fresh water that came in through the swamps close to where I grew up. And my dad would always make me fish with a cork because he said you could watch the cork, and if it moves a bit, you have yourself fish. My dad, however, he liked a tight line, which he'd put a weight on his and fish on the bottom for catfish. And I found some metaphor in that. And I'm going to end with this poem, which was originally in the MacGuffin. It was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. It's called The Bottom Fisher's Prayer. The Bottom Fisher's Prayer. Lord, I don't need a cork to know when the line is tight. Just give me the muddy water's ripple, the stillness broken by something swift deep beneath. I'm rooted like a slash pine trunk, sunk deep into the sandy soil. Though mayflies and gnats haze, I'm faithful. Keep that bait in the water, my father once taught me. You never know the life below. You never see the channel cat sleek juke and turn, how he eyes the cricket just to brush against it, to dare the lip-sunk hook, the tugging from above, the promise to drag him into the light.
I really like that work. It was such a vivid evocation of place.
Thank you. Place is one of my primary interests. I know that there's a kind of fine line between, I guess, simple local color where you're trying to give Easter eggs for people who might know the area and using that place to talk about something else. Models for me include people like Robert Frost, but more specifically, Seamus Heaney is probably my major model for a lot of my poems.
Yeah, I really got this sense that below the on the surface, but also below it, was this deep generational knowledge
Oh wow, thanks.
of the subregion. It was very powerful and very very engaging. For me as a listener, as a reader, I really, you evoke such a world with completeness and passion, and it really makes me want to kind of, I want to spend more time in Jeff Newberry's, Gulf Coast world, in his Georgia.
That makes me really happy. I was once at a conference, and another writer referred to North Florida and South Georgia as Jeff Newberry land, and it really meant a lot. It really meant a lot.
That's awesome.
To me because
It feels very well earned.
Oh, thanks, man. I'm trying to write the poems that I like to read. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to take a group of students to Ireland for the summer for a study abroad excursion. And one week, we were down in the southeast of Ireland. One weekend, I took some time to myself, and I took a train to Belfast, and then I took a bus out to Apalachee, which is this little village where Seamus Heaney grew up. And I was able to walk around. I stayed in a home there. I rented a room and a home there for a few days. And I remember going to this little Catholic church where Heaney is buried, and standing by his grave there, and realizing that although I was a world away from my home, I looked around. It was a little church in a little town with narrow roads. The air smelled like cows and agriculture. It was like being back home again. It was a really strange moment. And I remember thinking, man, if Heaney can turn this, to borrow something that was once sent to Faulkner, spot of postage stamp size of soil into literature, maybe I have enough for what I have too. And I remember walking back to my room, and there's a school in that town, and on the side of the building is a quote by Heaney, and it's the very last part of his famous poem Digging, and it's the pen rests between my thumb and my snug as a gun. I'll dig with it. And it was kind of this moment where I thought, yeah, I've got enough to dig with. Or fish with.
I love that quote. It's one of my favorites of his.
Isn't it great? Yeah, that poem opened up worlds to me because when I went to UGA for my graduate studies. And
when did you do that, Jeff?
I graduated my PhD in 2010.
I was at UGA, but he was much before.
I had a weird path. I graduated with a master's degree in 2002, and I was able to land this job at ABAC, where I teach now, a tenure track job. I was 27 years old, and they hired me full time. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I was here a couple of years, and I heard about a state grant to pay for my doctorate, and I applied and got it. And ABAC's been very generous. Even the president gave me a couple of years off to work on coursework, and I came back, and I've been here ever since. But those students to UGA, a lot of my workshops, they were superluminaries. There were people from Iowa in those classes, because at that point, this, Damien, it was one of the few schools or the universities in the nation that had a PhD with a creative writing focus. There weren't many around like that then. And a lot of people from Iowa and other big schools, and I felt really outclassed. I felt everybody had a poetic, everybody had a theory they were working with. And I just really wanted to write good work. And fortunately, I met a mentor, Ed Pavlich, who is still up there, and really helped me kind of, between him and Judith Ortiz-Kofer, who I studied with too.
Was
really
Coleman Barks still there?
I'm sorry?
Was Coleman Barks still there?
No, he had not been gone very long when I showed up. Terry Hummer was there too for a bit when I first got there. But taking Judith's workshop, that was the first time I'd written poems about Florida. And I wrote a whole suite of poems. Christina and I were talking before the show about how many the small towns around the area we grew up, they have weird pronunciations. And all the towns where I grew up down there, they have names like Apalachicola, Weewahitchika, and they're all American, they're Native American names, and they all are kind of jazz. And so I use those titles, and Judith really encouraged me to go in that direction and embrace that. And Ed was the one who told me, don't worry about what other people do, and you write the poems you have to write. And that's what I kind of leaned into.
Oh, I love Judith's work. She is, oh my goodness, I love her. I mean, what an
amazing person. She really, I mean, I was always awed by someone who not only writes scintillating poetry, but her prose is just as good. And I
I know her
aspire to
prose
be
more
that.
than her poetry, and I think you're right. It's just as good.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and speaking of mentors and working with people, I realized when you were talking, I know you because of Brent House,
Oh
because
yeah,
Brent
yeah,
is our colleague at
yeah,
well, what is now Penn West, California.
yeah.
So that's how I know you. And I was thinking, how do I know Jeff anyway? But I find that the writing world is both big and small,
It's
and
strange, right? Yeah.
it
I
is.
met Brent at a conference. There used to be a yearly conference, this little artsy town across the bay from Mobile, Fairhope, Alabama. And we met there, and it was a lovely conference. Every year I'd go, and Brent would come, and I just kind of out of the back of my head one day started talking to him. I said, we should do an anthology about Gulf Coast poetics. And Brent, rather than saying that sounds like work, said, yeah, let's do it. And so we solicited Snake Nation Press over in Valdosta, close to where I live now, did it. And I think a couple people used it in classes. I'm very proud of that book.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and the other thing I wanted to say while I was listening to you, growing up here where I did in northern West Virginia, we're like steel country,
Mhm.
Pittsburgh, Wheeling, all of this we make steel, or we made steel here. And I
Right,
think a lot of people, including me, don't associate the South with steel production,
right,
right? Because
right.
we think of Pittsburgh, Michigan, these,
Hmm.
Detroit, these
Hmm.
big cities that make
Hmm.
steel.
Except
Um,
Birmingham, Alabama, Christina.
well, I'm getting to that.
Okay,
And,
okay.
and Birmingham, of course, was a big steel industry. And here's the connection I have with you and Alabama. There was a little town next to Birmingham called Wheeling, Alabama.
Oh,
And it was because a major Wheeling steel magnate moved moved some of his operations to right outside of Birmingham, and built this whole industry down there, a steel mill and this whole thing. And then later the name was changed to Lipscomb. Have you
wow.
been to Lipscomb, Alabama?
I have not. I was about to say there's a wonderful three or
So many
four
people had
poems in
questions about that.
Jake Adam York's first book, Murder Ballads, about like the Bessemer furnaces there, and they're
Yeah.
fantastic. I mean, I still mourn his passing, and he was a great voice in Southern poetry. But that first book, Murder Ballads, it's so good, and it's got one is an image of like the steel falling like embers. It's just it's such a great book.
Well, and when I made that realization, because like growing up here, we think we own the steel industry because of where I live.
Right, right.
Right, but when I made the realization, oh man, there's other steel industries in the country, it brought us closer together as
Mhm.
Appalachians,
Yeah,
because this is all Appalachia, right?
right.
In one way or the other. And that was like my big connection. I loved listening to your work from your new book.
Oh,
I
thank you.
I hope everybody goes out and reads it. We've
Now,
got lots of comments here.
when does this book drop, Jeff?
I just put the final like edits in the mail the other day to Robert, who is the editor over at Red Hawk. I don't have a date. Sooner rather than later is what I think.
Well, we are glad to hear from you very early and before the release date. So thanks for
Yeah,
doing
You
that.
heard it here first, people.
Yeah.
yeah. This is the first reading I've done from this book. This is the first one for to support this. So I appreciate y'all have me on here and talking to me. I really do.
Oh, of course. And we've got some people here who chimed in. Karen says, I simply can't wait for Jeff's new book. That's great. Jacqueline adds a heart.
Oh, that's great.
And Jeff says the Fairhope conference was always fun. So I'm guessing you know Jeff
I do know Jeff. He's a Florida writer. Unfortunately, that conference, I think, like so many things after COVID, just never fully recovered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a similar thing with our own conference with going virtual, and then what do we do? And
Right.
lots of things changed because of that. So
It's difficult. I mean, you have to have someone to do it, and there's money issues and there's space issues. It's a labor of love, whatever you do.
for sure. Oh, and Mark adds, hey, Jeff, you're the man, brother.
Mark Mazzaro, he's a writer from South Florida. I was on faculty at Sanibel Island one year, several years ago, and Mark was I think a grad student at the time, and I met him there. He's a great guy, good writer, good short story writer.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on the show and trusting us with the first reading for this new collection. I hope you have lots more readings from this, and that people go out and buy this book when it comes out.
I hope so. I hope they do, and I hope they enjoy it, and I hope that I hope it's the kind of poetry you read and want to give to somebody else. Say, hey, you should read this.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Well, good night, Jeff, and good night, everybody. We will see you
Thanks,
same
David.
place next week. Good night.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah, see y'all.